Another most interesting aspect of the Express story is that the man allegedly seen rushing towards the beach is said to have been seen just 10 minutes after the Jane Tanner sighting at 9:15 p.m. The problem with this claim is that the Smiths say that their sighting was at 10 p.m. and that's 45 minutes, not 10 after the Jane Tanner sighting. So where did 10 minutes come from? It wasn't true at all. I suggest it must be clear by now that this whole Express article must have been handed, ready packaged, on a plate to the Express, who simply churned it out and no doubt made a few extra £1,000 from it by putting the story on their front page. The only person who could realistically have done this, that is, manufactured a story which once again confused the British public, was the McCanns PR spokesman, Clarence Mitchell. In the Express's account of the crying incident allegedly heard by Mrs. Fenn, they tell us that it happened 2 nights before Madeleine went missing, the Tuesday, not the night before. Before we leave the subject of Mrs. Fenn and the crying incident, let's now go back to her statement and examine very closely what she says. She says she heard a child start crying at 10:30 p.m. She says, due to the tone of the crying, it seemed to be a young child and not a baby of 2 years of age or younger. The term not a baby of 2 years of age or younger is a clumsy phrase. It could mean either under 2 or under 3. The relevance seems to be this. The McCanns twins, Amelie and Sean, were just 2 years and 2 months at the time the McCanns were in Pride of Luz. It does seem as though Mrs. Fenn was trying to rule out the possibility that it might have been one of the twins that she heard crying by using that awkward phrase, not a baby of 2 years of age or younger. She was, it seems, telling the police it must have been Madeleine, who was 9 days short of her 4th birthday on the day she disappeared. But we might well ask, could she really distinguish between the crying of a child aged, say, 2 years and 2 months, and one aged 3 years and 11 months, from the floor above? Had someone perhaps asked her to use this phrase in an attempt to prove that Madeleine was still alive on Tuesday the 1st of May? The matter became even more hard to unravel after Jerry and Kate McCann appeared on The Late Show in the Irish Republic in 2011. Up until that moment, the McCanns had come up with a tale that Madeleine had come down for breakfast on the morning of the 3rd of May, the day she was reported missing, and said quite casually, "Mummy, why didn't you come when Sean and I were crying last night?" The McCanns say that Madeleine didn't wait for an answer, but happily skipped away unconcerned. But on The Late Show, Jerry McCann introduced, for the first time, the idea that Amelie might have woken up and been crying on the Tuesday the 1st of May.
So I did actually, on the Wednesday night, I did actually spend the night in the room with the children.
And why is that significant, do you think?
Well, I don't know if it is, to be honest, Ryan. It's
Yeah.
just I felt I had to share absolutely everything.
But wasn't Madeleine upset the next day?
Well, the next morning she said, Mummy, I can't remember if it was Mummy or Daddy, why didn't you come when Sean and I were crying last night? And we both looked at each other and thought, that's odd, crying. And we didn't hear anything.
Yes.
And we had been back checking. And so we asked her, said, when did you cry? When, sometimes when we first put them to bed, they cried. And she just dropped it. And as we were saying, Madeleine was very articulate. And we kind of looked at each other and thought, did they wake up? Or was it the night before when Amelie had woken up?
In weighing up whether Mrs. Fenn's account is true or not, we've seen several reasons to doubt it, and one of the most important features about it is that it was not made until over 3.5 months after the event. Let's go back in time to what was happening in August. At the beginning of August, it had been 3 months since Madeleine had been reported missing. The abduction claim had been accepted by most. There was an international hunt for Madeleine, with claimed sightings of her all over the place. The McCanns were often pictured looking happy and relaxed. But then there were dramatic developments. The British police had been busy behind the scenes. Senior British police officers not connected to the Leicestershire Police, Lee Rainbow and Mark Harrison, had made an assessment that Madeleine might have died in the parents' apartment and that her parents may have conspired and arranged for her body to be hidden or disposed of. Lee Rainbow was the editor of this book, professionalising offender profiling. The Daily Mail described him in 2010 like this: Mr. Rainbow 37 leads a team of 5 criminal profilers at the National Police Intelligence Agency and specialises in sex crimes and murders. The Home Office agency, which describes itself as part of the police service, aims to improve police use of information, evidence and science to support operations. It is understood to have provided Portuguese police with a checklist of how to proceed. A spokesman said last night, "In disappearance cases, it is common for the NPIA to advise officers to consider the possibility of the involvement of family and close friends. This is good practice for investigating cases." The NPIA gave similar generic advice to Portuguese police. Mr. Rainbow, who has worked on major investigations including the Ipswich prostitute murders and the disappearance of Shannon Matthews, did not say there was any evidence the McCanns were involved, but his controversial report appears to have been a turning point in the Portuguese investigation. They sent top-class dog handler Martin Grime to Praia de Luz with 2 Springer Spaniels who had a 100% track record of alerting to the scent of a corpse. These dogs were not only capable of alerting to the presence of an actual corpse, but also to the past presence of a corpse. This is because the odour of human cadaverine is so powerful, which has a capacity to linger in any spot where a corpse has been lying for months or even years after the corpse has been removed. The dogs would be able to tell the police if there had been a dead body in the McCanns' apartment in the past few months. And as we now know, they did, the 2 dogs between them finding the scent of a corpse and blood in no fewer than 17 locations associated with the McCanns. On Monday the 6th of August, the McCanns were living in a villa provided for them. There was at this time plenty of international publicity about Madeleine. Sightings were still coming in thick and fast. The McCanns were in the limelight, doing carefully arranged photo shoots here and there, whilst others were minding their toddler twins. Then bad news struck. This is how Kate McCann refers to it in her book. On Monday, the 6th of August, the atmosphere changed. At the PJ's request, Jerry went off to meet them at a cafe in Portimao. They didn't need me, they said, so I stayed in the villa and busied myself looking after the children and doing some work. Jerry returned, minus the car. While he'd been in the cafe, the police had impounded it for forensic testing and brought him back to Praia de Luz. And we all know what followed. The dogs alerted to blood and the odour of a corpse in the car and in the McCann's apartment. News of these developments soon leaked out. There was a flurry of lurid headlines in the British press about a corpse, about sniffer dogs, about blood, about DNA. The Portuguese police also did a search of the McCann's villa, and the dogs alerted to places in the McCann's original apartment and on some of Kate McCann's clothes. I think it would be right to suggest that there must have been absolute panic and fear in the McCann camp. It was against this background that just 12 days after Jerry's car was impounded, the spate of newspaper stories began on Saturday the 18th of August, based essentially on the claims of Mrs. Fenn and her niece, Carol Tranmer. Influential stories about people burgling Ocean Club apartments and Madeleine crying on her own for 75 minutes. I suggested earlier that all these newspaper stories may have been planted by the McCann team and or Clarence Mitchell, and the 3 items featured in Mrs. Fenn's statement, the crying incident, the alleged burglary where Mrs. Fenn tried to grab the man's ankle and he jumped out of the window, and the suspicious man quietly opening and closing the garden gate, all helped to prop up the McCann's abduction story. Images of burglars and suspicious men continued to suggest that there really had been an abductor in the minds of those who read the British mainstream press, whilst the so-called crying incident probably served 2 purposes. 1, it proved, if true, that Madeleine was still alive on Tuesday night, the 1st of May. And 2, it confirmed the account of Madeleine being left alone for periods in the evening while the McCanns were dining out. The combined effect of all these newspaper stories was to fix ever deeper in the public mind that the McCanns had been leaving their children on their own in the evenings in between regular checks, and that an abductor had snatched her during one of those periods. Now, one feature of the newspaper stories on the 18th of August is that several of them mentioned that Mrs. Fenn was going to make a statement to the Portuguese police station at Portimao on the following Monday. Not only that, but they knew in advance exactly what she was going to say. These news reports were most likely planted by the McCann team / Clarence Mitchell. Did the Portuguese police know what Mrs. Fenn was going to tell them before she made her statement? It's very doubtful. Even if they did know, would they deliberately leak it to the British mainstream press, who got the story first? Surely that's even more unlikely. So this leaves the question, was there a degree of collusion between the McCann team and Mrs. Fenn? The McCann team, I suggest, when they were under great pressure, may have used Mrs. Fenn and her niece Carol Tranmer to give the Portuguese police 3 separate questionable stories, all of which suited the McCann team's agenda, stories of suspicious men and burglars, and a tale of Madeleine crying in the evening. I think it is quite possible, although I have no proof, that one or more of the McCann team, or indeed an intermediary, may have spoken to Mrs. Fenn before she made her statement. But whether I am right or wrong about that, can we take Mrs. Fenn's statement as any kind of indication that Madeleine was still alive on that Tuesday evening? I don't think we can. I will now examine some more third parties who claim to have seen Madeleine during the holiday. Staff at the Millennium restaurant were asked if they remembered seeing Madeleine on the Saturday night, when the McCanns and the group ate there on the first night, but all could only remember seeing the twins. But as they say, there were so many children there that first night. And in any event, we have the photos of Madeleine playing happily in the playground, probably on the first evening, dressed in the same clothes she was wearing on the plane journey to Portugal. On the morning of Sunday the 29th, the McCanns say they ate breakfast at the Millennium restaurant. If we accept the evidence I discussed earlier about the last photo, that seems to be convincing evidence that she was alive, happy, dressed in a pretty pink dress, and dipping her feet in the pool on a warm day at lunchtime that Sunday, the first full day of the holiday. But after this point, things become very vague. There is very little information, either in the Portuguese files or in Kate McCann's book, for example, which gives us much information about Madeleine or what was going on for the rest of the week. So I'm going to ask these 3 key questions. 1. Were there any independent, credible and verifiable sightings of Madeleine during this period? 2. Were the McCanns seen out and about as a happy family of 5? 3. Were the McCanns seen out and about as a family of only 4? The first point to note is that we have no confirmed photographs of the McCanns nor of any of their children after the Sunday that week. The last photo is probably from Sunday, and the tennis balls photo has so many queries about it that I do not think we can rely on that as any proof of Madeleine being alive after Sunday. Second, in over 8.5 years since Madeleine was reported missing, no one, not another holiday maker, a member of staff, a local, anyone to my knowledge, has come forward to say that they had seen Madeleine and the McCanns, all 5 of them together on that holiday, or as a family of only 4 together. Further, as we'll see in more detail in a moment, none of the statements made appear to give a definite indication of someone clearly having identified Madeleine as alive after Sunday. Third, there was a strange change of plan by the McCanns regarding breakfasts and lunches. Despite breakfast being included in the price of their holiday, they decided from Monday onwards to eat breakfast in their own apartment. That is confirmed by all their Tapas 7 friends. Their stated reason was that it was too far to walk to the Millennium for breakfast. But was there a different reason? Fourth, we are told in various places that all the Tapas 7 group would take all their children each day to the apartment occupied by the Paynes for a kind of buffet or sandwich lunch on their balcony. Yet the McCanns decided for the rest of the week after Sunday not to join their friends and to have their lunch in their own apartment, which was on the floor below that of the Paynes. No reason is given for this. But suppose something had happened to Madeleine by the Monday of that week. To stay in the apartment for lunch with just one parent bringing the twins home for lunch from the creche would avoid anyone seeing the four of them together and asking the obvious but awkward question, where is Madeleine? If the McCanns were to take only the twins to the Paynes apartment, people would inevitably ask the question, where's Madeleine? Fifth, we are told that on leaving their apartment during the week, one of the McCanns would leave via the back door of the apartment and the other parent by the front door. Why would they do this? Again, was it connected in some way with Madeleine being missing at this time? Is it possible that all of this apparent subterfuge was intended to disguise the fact that Madeleine was no longer with them? There was an echo of this in what we read earlier in Kate McCann's version of what happened on the evening of the 3rd of May, the night Madeleine is supposed to have disappeared. You'll remember that we looked earlier at Jerry McCann's second statement made on the 10th of May, a week after Madeleine was reported missing, where he said, "After 17:30 they went to the apartment. The deponent, Jerry McCann, having entered by the main door, which he did not lock while he was inside the residence, Kate and the children entered by the rear door, after this had been opened from the inside by the deponent." Why this strange routine? It looks as though this was their routine for the week after Sunday, so that the two parents would never be seen out with just the twins. So does this represent evidence that Madeleine was dead by Monday? Then we have some other very specific discrepancies to consider. On the Thursday of that week, the McCanns' friends all seem to have got together and taken their children down for the afternoon to the beach. There is a photograph of them all together at a beach restaurant between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m, taken by Fiona at the Paraiso restaurant, which compares with the ones from the Paraiso CCTV that we looked at earlier. But the McCanns say they put Madeleine in the creche that afternoon. There is no clear explanation as to why the McCanns and Madeleine didn't join their friends at the beach. Instead, the McCanns decided to play tennis. As part of the tale Kate McCann told about this late afternoon, she claims that on picking up Madeleine from her creche, she made a point of relating that she asked Madeleine on collecting her if she was upset about not going to the beach with the rest of the group. If Kate's story is true, surely when taking Madeleine to the creche that afternoon, she would already have known that all their Tapas 7 friends were going to the beach, and could have said to Madeleine at the time, "Ella won't be in your group this afternoon, but you'll be able to play with her at tea time." I suggest that this alleged conversation with Madeleine, asking her if she minded not being with the other children, may be a fabrication. It is possibly another example of a self-serving statement of no evidential value, designed to bolster a false account of that afternoon's events. And we saw earlier how statements about a supposed high tea that afternoon were so contradictory that it seems unlikely that that event ever happened. A further query relates to the afternoon of Tuesday the 1st of May. Pages 57 and 58. The McCanns hired a buggy that afternoon and took the children to the beach, returning them to the creche for the last hour of the afternoon session. Yet the creche records for that day clearly show that the children were put promptly back into the creche after lunch at 2:30 p.m. and collected at 5:30 p.m. Either Kate McCann's story is wrong, or the creche records are wrong, or both. Just one other point relating to hiring the buggy, as Kate McCann claims in a TV interview given by Jerry McCann in 2008. He attempted to explain how the McCanns almost didn't leave the children on their own on that Thursday evening, but nearly took them to the Millennium restaurant. So how was it they could hire a buggy on Tuesday, but not Thursday? That's one more thing that simply doesn't add up about the events that week, after Sunday. We dealt earlier with whether there was any reliable evidence that Madeleine was still alive on Thursday the 3rd of May, and saw that there didn't appear to be. So do we have any reported sightings of Madeleine by other people from the Sunday through to the Thursday. We have these, and I shall examine each one. Kat Baker, Madeleine's nanny. A tapas restaurant cook who claimed to have seen Madeleine. A claimed sighting of Madeleine at a tennis lesson by journalist and former Crime Watch reporter Bridget O'Donnell. And a family who claimed their children were playing with the McCanns and their children on the Wednesday afternoon. So, first of all, what does Kat Baker say about Madeleine that week? She is asked by the police and says, "Most of the time in which I saw the family together, the children would be eating. The twins appeared tired at lunch after a long day, and also perhaps due to the heat, but I never took much notice of the McCanns' behaviour that week." That is the clearest possible contradiction with the McCanns' equally clear statements that they were taking breakfast and lunch in their own rooms and not going to any of the Ocean Club eating places at lunchtime. If the McCanns were telling the truth about having their meals in their room, it means Kat Baker wasn't with them when they were having breakfast and lunch. The McCanns were eating in their own apartment. So has Kat Baker made this up in order to try to convince the police that Madeleine was alive that week? But in any event, we saw earlier how Kat Baker seemed to have been on very friendly terms with the McCanns, and is therefore not an independent witness. Second, let's look at the statement by the tapas restaurant cook, Maria Manuela Antonia Jose. She made a statement to the police on the 6th of May. Here is an extract from her statement. When she was informed about the disappearance, she did not realise which child this was. It was only later, upon watching the television news that night, and after seeing pictures of the missing child on television, that she realised who the girl was, referring to her as Madeleine, the name used by the journalists, remembering only at that moment that she had seen her during the meals provided to the children at the creche, and which take place at the restaurant where she worked, and during arrivals at the creche where Madeleine spent the day, located immediately next to the restaurant. However, Madeleine was enrolled that week in Kat Baker's Lobster Club creche for 3 to 5-year-olds, which was located on the first floor of the main reception. That was not near the restaurant where Maria Jose worked. Moreover, she talks of meals provided to the children at the creche. But children didn't have meals at the creche. They didn't have breakfast there, and they all went back with their parents at lunchtime. It's not certain by any means that the children all had high teas every day. Further, she gives no specific detail about Madeleine. Next, she claims to have recognised Madeleine from the pictures on TV. This creates a further problem for her evidence, and that's because, as we've seen, the photo she saw on television that weekend would have been the so-called first photo, as we saw earlier. This was of a much younger Madeleine. David Payne's daughter Lily looked similar to Madeleine. Here is a photo of Lily on holiday in Praia de Luz. On the left, side by side with a photo of Madeleine, just before she went on holiday. Perhaps for the tapas cook, this was a simple case of mistaken identity. Hers is a vague statement, giving no reliable or checkable details about any specific occasions. She worked in the restaurant and probably saw lots of children coming and going. It looks then as if this witness could be mistaken. She made claims about having seen Madeleine taking meals that week, when in fact the McCanns were having lunch with the twins in their apartment every day. Third, Bridget O'Donnell, who was a journalist and writer. She used to work on BBC Crime Watch. She is the partner of filmmaker Jeremy or Jez Wilkins, who did much of the filming for the ITV documentary series My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. She was asked to write a long article in the mainstream media in December 2007 because she was actually in Praia de Luz the same week as the McCanns. She titled her article, My 6 Months with Madeleine. This was a reference to her having been with the McCanns that week in Praia de Luz, and therefore she claims having lived with Madeleine for the 6 months since she went missing. But despite that extravagant title, and despite she and Jez having become friends with the McCanns that week, there is not one sentence in the whole long article referring to or describing Madeleine, nor does she describe any specific incident. The only thing that comes anywhere near it is this reference to Madeleine playing tennis on Thursday morning. Earlier that day there had been tennis lessons for the children, with some of the parents watching proudly as their girls ran across the court chasing tennis balls. They took photos. Madeleine must have been there, but I couldn't distinguish her from the others. They all looked the same, all blonde, all pink and pretty. The statement, Madeleine must have been there, is hardly convincing, especially with no other reference to her by Miss O'Donnell. So we cannot count that as credible evidence of having seen Madeleine any time that week either. So forth I come to the Boyd family, who claimed that their little boy played with Madeleine for most of the Wednesday afternoon, the day before Madeleine was reported missing. Their story surfaced in a small circulation family periodical, First magazine. Here is a photo of the actual article, which appeared just 2 weeks after Madeleine was reported missing. The Boyd family was certainly in Pride of Luz that week. Indeed, it appears that they feature in the playground picture, which we noted was almost certainly taken on the first day of the holiday. Mr. Jason Boyd, then aged 39, is the man in the red shirt left of picture, with his wife Vicky, aged 34. Their son Louis was 3, and they also had a 10-month-old baby with them. A year later, the family featured in Rupert Murdoch's Sun. Here's a photo of the family on the beach, reading The Sun. The article by local Portuguese journalist Daniel Gusmaroli began with this claim. The day before she disappeared, Maddie spent an idyllic afternoon playing in the sun with 3-year-old Louis Boyd. Louis's mum shares her story with First magazine. The article asked, will Maddie's mum ever recover? If we look at the detail of Mrs. Boyd's account, the feature writer tells us this. Louis Boyd couldn't believe that his new friend was so good at football. After all, she was only a girl. The 3-year-old was having great fun tearing around with the pal he had met that afternoon. Her name, Madeleine McCann, and they were giggling as they fooled around by the pool as their parents looked on. Later in the article, Louis is said to have looked at the posters Madeleine featured in around Pride of Luz and asked his mother, Mummy, is this the girl I was playing with yesterday? His mother said, yes. Louis is said to have replied, why are her pictures everywhere? His mother said, because she's lost her mummy. And the article notes that Louis went quiet. Later the article goes on. Vicky was sitting by the pool as Maddie's mum Kate, 38, relaxed on a sun lounger and watched her children whizzing down the water slide. Maddie was wearing a sun hat, a little pink top and blue skirt, occasionally stopping to pull faces at her mum. As Kate looked on adoringly, Maddie went to the poolside to a play area to have a game of play football with Louis. Just a sweet, happy little girl playing in the sun with other children. She and Louis were kicking a football around for about an hour. The two of them were giggling and having fun. They got on really well together. I spoke to Maddie's mum, Kate, briefly. She told me this was their first holiday abroad with the kids, and they were all having a lovely time. She felt the Portuguese were lovely people and very family-orientated. Madeleine's dad, Jerry, 38, was playing tennis on a nearby court at the time, and after the match he joined Kate and put his arm around her. They seem like a really happy family, a good strong family unit. She is quoted as saying, when the posters went up on the Friday, Mrs. Boyd said, we recognised Maddie immediately. Well, it certainly makes good copy, except of course that the photos of Madeleine that went up that week were of the so-called first photo that was anything up to 18 months out of date. The article also included half a page about Kate McCann's initial reaction to Madeleine disappearing. It states, Kate and Jerry telephoned local priest Father David Heel, asking him to visit them at their apartment. When he arrived with his wife, Kate threw herself into the priest's arms and she broke down. The article continues. It took him almost 3 hours to comfort Kate. Father Heel explains in the article how the McCanns asked him to pray for Madeleine's safe return. The priest added, we have been to see them several times when they are emotional and distraught. So in this lengthy article, we have what appears to be crystal clear, watertight evidence of Madeleine being alive and playing happily on the day before she disappeared. It sounds like it was most of the afternoon. Madeleine playing around the pool, then playing football for an hour, then returning to be with Mummy and Daddy by the pool. But there are two very big problems with this story, and several others besides. First, the creche records for that afternoon that we looked at earlier. What do they tell us? Let's have a look. They clearly tell us that Madeleine was shown as being in the Lobster Group creche with her nanny Kat Baker all afternoon from 2:45 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. So there's a conflict of evidence. Was she playing football with Louis or in the creche all afternoon with Kat Baker? It can't have been both. But there's another possible way of checking what happened that afternoon, and that's to look at what Kate McCann says about that afternoon in her book Madeleine. We find it on page 60, Wednesday the 2nd of May 2007. Our last completely happy day. Our last to date as a family of 5. If only it was possible to rewind, even for an hour. Today it rained. The children went to their clubs, but our tennis lessons were postponed. Instead, we joined Fiona, David and Diane at the Millennium restaurant for coffee. We then returned to our apartment, and a little while later I left again to go for a run with Matt. I'd bought a new pair of running shoes a few days before we'd left for Portugal, and they were certainly getting a good initiation. They were pink, which I wasn't quite sure about. I wondered how seriously a runner in pink trainers could be taken, but after a few outings in the sand, they weren't looking quite so glaringly girly. As we ran along the promenade, a small dog jumped out from under a bench and attacked my right calf. It was pretty sore, and I was a bit shaken, but I carried on as coolly as I could manage. Maybe he just didn't like those pink trainers. Jerry and I picked up the children, had lunch in the apartment, and then took them to the play area for an hour before walking them to their clubs. The tennis group lessons were rescheduled for the afternoon, Jerry's group first, followed by mine. After that, it was the usual routine. Tea with the children, playtime, bath time, milk, stories, kids' bedtime, get ready. So, no mention of any sun, only a mention of rain. And certainly no mention of Madeleine happily playing football with little Louis for an hour, or whooshing down the water slide. So what can we make of this? Was it fabricated by the Boyds? Were they roped in by the McCann team to concoct this story? Did the publishers of First Magazine check their story out with the McCanns? Whichever it was, no way can we take this as any proof that Madeleine was alive on Wednesday the 2nd of May.